Okay, this next lecture will be about the classical period in Greece, so the period following the Persian invasions, when the city of Athens really becomes a cultural and artistic center. So we'll be looking at some examples of sculpture to start and thinking about this new naturalism or this heightened naturalism that we see during the classical period, where there's a new attention to the human form and an attention to the movement of the body and the idea of harmony in the different parts of the body. So we'll start off by looking at some representations of the human form and then move on to some large-scale building projects following the Persian invasions, and then get through all of the Acropolis or some of the Acropolis building projects, moving into the period of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens will actually fall from power as we move towards the late classical and Hellenistic periods. So starting off, I show you a representation of the Doryphoros, or the spear bearer, by Polykleitos, which is actually a Roman copy that we see here. So we don't have an original, but this one gives you a sense, this image gives you a sense of what the original looked like. So you have a figure holding onto a spear, shifting into a dramatic contrapposto pose. So that pose that we saw with the Critios boy, where the figure is shifting his weight onto one leg. And this causes the whole body to react. So the shoulders will move, the hips will move, the knees will move. So the entire body will shift and react to this contrapposto pose. And of course, this is a much more natural way for the human body to stand. Typically, we do not stand with our weight equally shifted on 2 feet. Typically, we will shift our weight onto one leg. So it's actually a much more naturalistic way of doing it. If we look at the figure, if we look at this other image, which is a reconstruction of the figure holding onto a spear, you can see that this figure is all about balance and harmony. So this idea, Polykleitos was very interested in the idea of how to create the ideal set of proportions for the human body and how to have kind of this reaction on one side and another. So you'd have one diagonal going in one direction, another diagonal going in another direction. So if one diagonal is going up, another one should be going down. One going up, another should be going down. So you have that nice sense of harmony. Also, in the idea of what should the proportions be, this was considered the ideal proportions at that time set out by Polykleitos. For example, the head should fit inside the body 7 times. So the size of the head should then fit inside the body 7 times. You can see that the contrapposto is a little bit more dramatic here, and the fact that this is a Roman copy tells us and hints for us as we move towards the ancient Romans in our lectures that the Romans were great admirers of the Greeks, the classical period as well as other periods, and so works like this by Polykleitos became very well respected and copied in marble later on. A lot of Greek originals were created in bronze, and so they were melted down, or they just don't survive to us due to age. So in this case, it's good that the Romans did like to copy them because we are able to see or get an idea of Polykleitos' original, although it is not the actual original. Another work that's quite famous by Myron, the Discus thrower, again is a Roman marble copy, so another example of a sculpture that was appreciated by the ancient Romans, also dating to about 450 BCE. And again, we get the sense of balance, so one diagonal going this way, another going this way, one going this way, another going this way. And the artist has selected this moment at the height of the action, right? So this moment where the discus thrower has whipped his arm back and he's at this momentary pause before releasing his discus. You can see that there's a new attention to anatomy. You can see details of the ribs. Here, details of the muscles throughout the arms. Again, this is a Roman copy, but we presume that there are some details that are mimicking what we saw or what was seen in the Greek original. In both cases, things like this support, this marble support, if it were created in bronze originally, it would not be necessary. Marble lacks a certain tensile strength, so you need to have that kind of support. If we go back, you can see this one has a little tree trunk sticking out of it, as well as a strut that connects the hand and the hip. And so this is yet another support that's necessary for marble sculptures that were created by the Romans. So we have this moment of momentary pause before the discus thrower is to release his discus. So really the only unnaturalistic thing about this is the serious expression that we see on the face here, which really reveals no emotion. So kind of keep this in mind, because as we move towards the Hellenistic period, we'll see some dramatic emotion incorporated into these sculptures. But at this point, we're not seeing too much expression. Okay, let's move on to the type of building projects that we see at this time. So first off, as we looked at that discus thrower, obviously games were very important, athletic competitions. So what was the most famous athletic competition site? Of course, to us, it's Olympia, which was a site dedicated to the god Zeus. The first Olympic Games were in 776, but there was actually a new temple complex constructed in 470 from 470 to 456 BCE. So this is actually a period following the Persian invasions. The temple itself collapsed in the 10th century, so this is all that survives today. You can see the area of the competitions, but this is an image done by computer-generated imagery, so it gives you a sense of what the sanctuary and the competition area looked like originally. Okay, so the Temple of Zeus shows us a few things about Doric temples at this time. Doric is this relatively plain style of column that we see here. So Doric temples would have included some painting details, some pedimental sculpture, so the pediment again is that triangle. And then the typical dimensions would be you'd have a certain number of columns in the front, in this case 6, and then you would double that number and add 1 along the side. So you have 6 columns here and 13 along the side. You would have a lot of sculptures around this area, so sculptures of the gods, sculptures of athletes, and any kind of disgraced athlete would have its sculpture removed. But it's an interesting combination of both worship and appreciation of athletes and athletics. So here we can see the size of this temple. It was a big deal when this temple was created because it was created after the Persian invasions. They spent a lot of money on it, and there had actually been an oath taken that after the Persian invasions, they wouldn't rebuild the destruction. They wouldn't rebuild the destruction caused by the Persians. And slowly people began breaking this promise, this idea of the Oath of Plataea, which is still somewhat controversial. It's recorded by later historians, but this idea that you're going to leave things as they were when the Persians were there. And so slowly the Greek civilizations begin these large building projects after the Persian invasions, when they're feeling pretty good. So this is the Doric order. You can see relatively plain column capital, an area for decoration called a metope, this area here with 3 lines called a triglyph. The column itself sits directly on what's known as the stylobate, and here you can just see a little bit more detailed version. The Doric order is usually thought as the more masculine and simple order. All right, so this is a peripteral temple. Peripteral temple just means there's a single row of columns all around the outside. In the inside is what's known as the cella or naos. You have the porch or the pronaos right here. These are called columns in antis, or columns inside the porch, columns in antis, and what's known as the opisthotamos. So the opisthotamos is usually a treasury area. This is sometimes called a colonnade or peristyle, just a row of columns. And the idea is you're not really going to go inside the cella. It's not really for everyone to go into. This is where the cult image would be, and only certain people would be allowed in to see things like this, the reconstruction of the gold and ivory statue of Zeus by Phidias, who will also carve the one at the Acropolis. So the individual that's instrumental in the construction at the Acropolis is Pericles. So Pericles is a leader in the Greek government. We see him here with his beard, and he was instrumental because at this point we have the Delian League, which was important for funding for the Acropolis building project. The Delian League was originally called so that they could have funds and also resources so that they could make sure that no invasions like the Persian invasions ever happened again. So they have this as funding for that, but they end up starting to use the money for other things, and Athens takes control of this fund, of this treasury. So the Delian League, which was originally on Delos, ends up in Athens, and Pericles now has access to it, or it's available. They also no longer honor the Oath of Plataea, as I mentioned before, so they're now building, they're now reconstructing. And so what do these new building projects look like? So there had been a temple that they were working on for Athena. Well, now it's even bigger and greater. They have a temple that's called the Parthenon that will be even bigger than the temple dedicated to Zeus, as well as a small structure dedicated to Nike, the goddess of victory, and a small temple known as the Erechtheion that is dedicated to, or that houses the archaic image of Athena, as well as other important sites and commemorates other important events. So as we look at the Parthenon, you can see it has that idea or same kind of decoration with the pedimental sculpture, the decoration in the metopes as well. You also have that same ratio, 8 columns in the front, but then you double it plus 1. So in this case, you have it 8 by 17. So much, much larger than we saw in Olympia. So you also have, let me see. Oh, I guess I don't have that one. So you also have some optical corrections. You have some things that are done to make sure that you see straight lines, even though they're not all straight. So for example, the columns on the building bulge in the center. This is called entasis. So there's a slight bulge to the columns as they move down so that the building looks stable and so the columns don't look weak. Also, the steps appear straight along this edge, but they're actually 2 inches higher right here and 4 inches higher up here in the center than they are at the corners. So you have this slight curvature along what's known as the stylobate, or the floor of the temple. So this slight curve, and this ensures that there's no look of like sagginess right in the middle of the temple. So no sagging here, no sagging here. This also kind of gives a roundness to the temple, or kind of gives it a strength, a look of strength. So there's been lots of ideas about why they made these refinements or optical corrections. And the final one here is just that the corner columns are thicker, that they're really quite thick at the corner. And this is because they're bathed in light on all sides. And if something's bathed in light, it can tend to look thinner. So again, by keeping things looking strong, you're going to keep those corner columns a little thicker. Okay. So here you can just see the floor plan or the ground plan. You can see there is a lot of sculpture going on all throughout this. We're just focusing on a few examples. This is a reconstruction of the gold and ivory sculpture that was inside the temple that very few people would be able to see. You can see Athena, Parthenos, or Athena the maiden, is holding on to Nike, the goddess of victory, and has her helmet and her shield here. And then here we can see one of the pedimental sculptures that's actually a reconstruction because they're all in pretty rough shape. One pediment was the birth of Venus, and this one is the contest between Athena and Poseidon. This was the contest to see who would be the patron god or goddess of the city of Athens. And Athena won. She won because she gave a gift of an olive tree to the people of Athens. You can see that olive tree peeking out in this reconstruction behind her. Poseidon, god of the sea, holding his trident, he gave them a bubbling brook, or like some water. He struck the rock and water came out. And the Athenian people thought that was a good gift, but in fact that water was salt water, so they didn't really want that gift. This area of the Acropolis, this elevated area that was decorated with sacred structures, was part of what was known as the Panathenaic Procession. So every 4 years from the Dipylon Gate, so where that area of the Dipylon Cemetery or Acropolis was, you would process through the Agora, the mercantile center of the city, and up towards the Acropolis. And here you can just see a reconstruction of people moving up towards the Parthenon and the other temples and structures up above. And they would bring a garment to dress the archaic image of Athena. And this was an image that was housed in the Erechtheion, and it was made of olive wood and believed to have fallen from the sky. There is a debate as to where the Parthenon marbles should be displayed. Most of them, or a lot of them, were taken at the beginning of the 19th century to England, and they're now in the British Museum. But very recently, the Greeks have now opened a museum that houses what marbles they have, and also has a place for every marble from the British Museum. So some people have suggested they should be returned, but as of now, they're still with the British collection. The Ionic temple that we see, or a structure that demonstrates the Ionic types of columns, the Ionic order, we see here in the temple of Athena Nike, and you can see this would have had a balustrade with decorations of Nike in different poses, as well as decorations of scenes from the Persian War, Greeks defeating the Persians, areas for sacrifice as well. The Ionic order has these curving volutes and is known as a more feminine order. We also have the Erechtheion, which commemorates the olive tree that Athena gave, and also the area where Poseidon struck the rock. You can see it's also done in that Ionic order, and the architect had to negotiate very, very uneven terrain. We also see a porch made out of what are known as caryatids. So these are columns made out of female figures. So this concludes our tour of the Acropolis. There are many other structures, but this gives you a sense of what the Acropolis was all about and how it functioned.